Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of the American Planning Association and Vice Chair of APA's New Urbanism Division. I'll be the moderator for today's webcast. Today is Wednesday, June 3rd, and we will hear the presentation New Context for Aging and Livable Communities. So this was a rescheduled webcast from earlier this past month. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown. For your content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And please do indicate which presenter you would like to answer your question. And we will answer these questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Okay, on your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thanks to all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Private Practice Division. To learn more about APA's divisions, visit planning.org/divisions. And to learn about the chapters, planning.org/chapters. On your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, please visit our new site, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you're interested in proposing a session, you can contact your chapter or division or email Ben Frost at bfrost@nhhfa.org. We have actually very few Fridays left open for the remainder of the year, so we have a packed schedule. And to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just go to your dashboard on APA's website and select Activities by Provider. Today's provider, again, is the Private Practice Division, and then you can select today's title. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education. For availability of our distance education credits, again, just visit our webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive the most up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. And we are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will be available at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. I'd now like to turn it over to Ramona Malahi. She is with the Private Practice Division, and she will get our session started today. Ramona.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome to everyone from the Private Practice Division as past chair. Today's broadcast is really taking a look at what are the new contexts in aging and livability. We do know that America is aging and that this demographic change is both unprecedented and also global in nature. So when we think about an aging demographic, it's both a personal and a community impacted decision. We're looking at a lot of things that happen not only as individuals, but how those issues impact the community. Aging is an opportunity for all of our communities to really take a look at the way we can improve the communities to address an aging demographic. One of the things that we need to take a look at is really that in this aging demographic, as people are aging, another demographic that will also be increasing will be the children ages 0 and 17. So when you take a look at by 2030, you'll have 72 million people over age 65 and 80 million people between 0 and 17. There's been a number of surveys of seniors to get a better feel in regards to what they are looking at. And, you know, the issues have changed slightly over the years. Housing, finances, health, transportation, they have all been very important issues for seniors. Baby boomers recently, who, as we know from AARP, say that 10,000 age yearly to turn 60 per day, 10,000 per day, turn 65. And we're taking a look and wondering exactly what they feel and how supportive the community is. So really the question that we're looking at is, are we as individuals and communities ready for an aging population? When we take a look at how ready our communities are, we're looking really at a paradigm shift rather than aging in place, which is low centralized to aging in your home, but more aging in community and taking a look at that network of social capital and relationships that help you as an individual to lead a good quality of life. So APA has put together a toolkit to help communities and planners in regards to addressing this issue. And the things that we will focus on today is the toolkit, which I will present in brief. We'll also take a look at the new Livability Index that AARP has launched at the APA National Conference in Seattle in April. We'll also take a look at the multi-generational planning aspect, and finally the community resilience framework. So APA's tools right now available is on the radar, and that is the Aging and Livable Communities Initiative, and that is a division council focused effort. And if you take a look at those web pages, they have a lot of contextual information on best practices, and we've just added a new focus on a community effort in Connecticut in regards to addressing aging and livable communities. So if you're looking for background, context, and resources and tools, on the radar available on our planning website is available, and you should access that. There's also a great fact sheet and information in regards to multi-generational planning, and Mildred, one of our speakers today, will elaborate more on that. And finally, there's the Aging and Community Policy Guide that was passed in 2014. And the Aging and Community Policy Guide really sets in place the overall principles of what planners should consider when addressing this issue in the local community. The areas that the policy guide organizes itself around is community engagement, housing, transportation, land use, economic well-being, community assets and supports. And the new upcoming PS report called Planning Aging Supportive Communities, which will be published this month and will be available through APA's PAS, the Planning Advisory site, is really a complement in this toolkit organized around the similar topics and planning categories as the policy guide, which will focus on housing, mobility, the public realm and public services, as well as just how to put this all together to plan the aging and supportive communities. One of the things that this toolkit really provides is an opportunity to give resources and information and to really help each community to evaluate its needs, its challenges, and its current assets in being able to plan for aging supportive communities. Today's presenters, let me introduce them. Our first presenter is Jana Lynott, and she's with AARP, and she's going to be talking about the new Livability Index that AARP rolled out. Jana is the Senior Strategic Policy Advisor for the AARP's Public Policy Institute, and she's really the go-to person in regards especially to transportation issues, and one of her success stories has been Complete Streets. Mildred Warner is a professor with Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell, and she has focused her practice on a number of different issues: government service delivery, economic development. But the work that we'll focus on today is her work on planning across generations and the multi-generational model and suggestions and recommendations for planners. And our last speaker is Lindsay Goldman. She's the project director of Age Friendly New York City. And what she'll speak today about is the report that they released last year on resilient communities empowering older adults in disasters and daily life, which really details the findings and recommendations of a year-long study of older adults in disasters with a special focus on Hurricane Sandy. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Jana.
Well, thank you very much, Ramona. Let's see. I don't see the pop-up for me to accept. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I'm going to show my screen. Can everyone see my presentation slide now?
Yes, you look great.
Okay, great. And you can hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Well, wonderful. Again, I'm Jana Leinert with the AARP's Public Policy Institute, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to share our new Livability Index, Great Neighborhoods for All Ages, with you today. We've put a number of years into creating the Livability Index. There's a lot of research behind our tool, as well as a lot of thinking about how we can best design the tool to make it very user-friendly and interactive. And as we were going through this process, we very much had in mind community planners as a primary audience of users of the tool. So really glad that you're able to join us today and get kind of firsthand knowledge about what's in the Livability Index, as well as how you might be able to use it to support your own livable communities work. So AARP has been working in the realm of livable communities for a couple of decades, and this is our working definition of what constitutes a livable community. It's one that's safe and secure. It has affordable and accessible housing and transportation options. It offers supportive community features and services, and that all of these things together enhance personal independence, as well as allow residents to age in their communities and foster their engagement in the community's civic, economic, and social life. So we started with this definition of livability and then started to build out our Livability Index. And so each of these features is part of the measurement of the tool. So why did we create the Livability Index? Well, we know from many years of survey research of people 50 plus that most people want to age in their own communities. It's really the minority of people that pick up and move to retirement locations, largely in the South. Most people stay in place. And we also understand that by and large, our communities in the United States are not yet ready to really meet the needs of older adults and really people of all ages adequately. So people really expect as they age that the community is going to have the type of environment and services that they need to age in place. So what we've tried to do with our Livability Index is put a very powerful tool in the hands of community planners and other community leaders so that you can, at a real glance, understand what are some of the strengths of your community, as well as where are some of the weaknesses, what are some of those threats to livability, and then connect you to resources to really put some actions in place to make your community more livable for people of all ages. We're really hoping that our Livability Index will help catalyze community conversations for lasting change. It's a powerful tool. We include over 60 indicators in the index, pulling data from more than 50 different data sources. So for community planners, it's a wonderful opportunity to combine data from the index with your own local data for something very powerful information about your community. But beyond just the data, we've tried to design the user interface to be very easy, user-friendly, interactive. So we hope that this is a tool that you can take into your community meetings, have citizens interact with it, and really start to see some of those connections between things like health in the built environment. So this is the opening screen of our index, and I'm going to give a quick demo in just a moment. I guess before I do that, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of what is in the index. What are we measuring, and how did we decide to measure those pieces? So first off, we have 7 categories of livability. We include across those 7 categories 40 metrics. These are quantitative type of data-based information, as well as 20 policy or programmatic bits of information. For our policy side, those are brownie points that we give to communities that have put policies or programs in place that help lay the groundwork for improvements in livability over time. So across each of these categories of livability, we include a commitment to livability. So communities that have made a sustained commitment to improving their livability and age friendliness get an additional total 1 policy point. That's true across each of these categories. And then within the different categories, we'll start at the top: engagement. We're looking at broadband access, civic and social engagement, equal rights. Under opportunity, we look at equal opportunity, economic opportunity and education, multi-generational communities, and local fiscal health. Our housing category are largely metrics related to housing accessibility and affordability. Neighborhood is really the quintessential definition that city planners have for walkable mixed-use communities. Transportation, we look at options, cost, safety, and accessibility. Environment includes measures for air and water quality, as well as program points for community resilience and energy efficiency. And then finally, under health, we include healthy behaviors, access to healthcare, and quality of healthcare. Now, how did we decide on what to measure? Well, I mentioned that AARP has many years of its own research. In addition, at the start of this project, we did a very in-depth individual preference survey, interviewed more than 4,500 adults age 50 and older, and really asked them about what are the key community features, amenities, characteristics that will help you age in place, as well as what are some of the key investment priorities that you would have for local government. So we put this information together, formed a technical advisory committee of 30 members, and with expertise across each of these categories of livability, and came up with these key attributes of livability. From there, we conducted research into data sets that would best measure these attributes. So in addition, we were looking for data that has of good quality and how well it measured each of the attributes, whether it provided data for the entire United States, and whether it provided information down to the neighborhood level. 21 of our 40 metrics provide information down to the census block group level or neighborhood level. Thus, we call this a neighborhood livability index. And then finally, we wanted to select indicators that were understandable, communicable, and actionable. So a local elected official could understand and communicate the importance of these various elements in the community and be able to take action to improve upon a particular indicator. So for instance, we do not include weather in our livability index because we have very little control, at least in the short term, over weather. Okay, so I'm actually going to quickly switch over to the demonstration. And this is the landing screen of the Livability Index, as I've shown before. And immediately it welcomes you to enter an address, zip code, city name, etc. I just want to show you the page in its completeness. It gives a quick summary of each of the categories, as well as we have an ongoing Twitter feed. Please use hashtag livindex, LIVINDEX, to join our conversation about this. A short video. We will also soon have a link to a blog series, etc., and other resources. So I have loaded up an address. It's just a random address for the top neighborhood in one of the top cities performing in our livability index, which is south of Market in San Francisco. So I'll enter that. And what it does is returns a score for a particular neighborhood. So you can enter any level of geography, but this index is built from the neighborhood level up, census block group up. So the smaller level of geography that you enter, the more refined the results that you'll get back. If you enter an address, you're going to have a score returned for your neighborhood. If you enter a city name, it's going to return a score for a city. So you can see here that this particular neighborhood scores a 75 out of 100 in our index, and that is actually quite good. Our top scoring neighborhood in the index today is 78. It's possible to score as high as 100, but you would have to basically be the top scoring place in every category of livability. So in addition to the total score, it shows you a score 0 to 100 again for each category of livability, for which we have 7 categories of livability. In each of those categories, the total score, let me back up, is based on the average of each of the category scores, and each of the category scores are based on the average of the performance against each metric and policy within a particular category. So let's take, for instance, this neighborhood in San Francisco scores very well on transportation. If you want to see exactly what it is we measure on transportation, you can open up for more information. Click on transportation. You can see each of the 7 metrics that we include within this category of livability, from frequency of public transportation service, walk trips, speed limits, crash rates, etc. In addition, if you are really curious to understand exactly what are you measuring under each, you can click on any of these plus marks and get the fuller definition and some of the rationale for why we included the measure in the index, as well as the original data source, a link back. So we've tried to be very transparent in where the data comes from and how we are measuring things. In addition to our policies, our metrics, I mentioned we have 20 policies across the 7 categories of livability. And once we calculate a score for a category based on the metrics, we then add policy points to that score. And you can see that San Francisco has a complete streets policy. They have state policy that's supportive of volunteer drivers, and they are part of the network of age-friendly communities. There's actually a few different ways that you could get an additional policy point in addition to joining AARP's network of age-friendly communities. And again, you can also open up these tabs to get more information on an individual policy. Our third tab on the results screen are resources. We want to link you to additional resources that we think will be valuable, and we'll continue to build that out. Another thing I want to show you is our map feature. So immediately by default, it maps the total score. And you can, as you scroll out, you can start to see how it changes from one neighborhood to the next and see some trends across your community. But not only do we map the total score, but you're able to map socio-demographic information, each of the categories of livability, as well as select metrics that are used in the index. And in a few instances, we include information that does not contribute to scoring, those items marked with an asterisk, but which we think are very informative to better understand community livability. So for instance, we include life expectancy on the index. And this is a county level indicators, so you really have to kind of scroll out to start seeing differences. And then I'm just going to scroll across the United States, and you can get a sense. I think this is a very powerful tool to really start seeing trends within communities as well as in the country as a whole. So as we move to the southeast, you can see many, many counties where life expectancy is in the lower third relative to other counties in the United States. And if we scroll northward, northern communities have higher life expectancy. You can also map things like walk trips. This is one of the major contributions of the Livability Index. Our two consulting firms, well, one consulting firm, ICF International, helped us design, research, build this index, and then University of Utah's Metropolitan Research Center, led by Reed Ewing, modeled several of our metrics, and walk trips is one of those. We have walk trips modeled down to the neighborhood level, so you can actually scroll in to get back to that neighborhood level and start to see differences across the community and the number of walk trips per household. So moving along, another tool within the index itself is the ability to type in up to 3 locations. Just to show you how that's done, I'll type in Chicago. I've preloaded a few of these locations, and you can make a comparison of up to 3 communities against every category of livability, as well as click on a particular category and see how each of these performs against individual metrics and policies. So it's very interesting to note things like opportunity, income, inequality, differences across the United States, etc. So let me just quickly show you another feature of the tool. I'm going to go back to, I'll just click on Salt Lake City here. That's going to take us to Salt Lake City results, scoring a 56 out of 100. And we understand that livability means different things to different people. And in recognition of that, we allow users to customize their score. So you can click on this, and for instance, say you have all the money in the world and housing affordability and accessibility is not that important to you. You can make it less important in the index and see how your score changes. Similarly, you might say that being located in a live, work, and play neighborhood is extremely important, and maximize that weight of that particular category, and again, change your score accordingly. So it's kind of a fun way to play around, acknowledging that different strokes for different folks.
Jana, this is your wrap-up warning then finally, that you requested.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, great, thank you. And the final thing to show you, we have a link to our featured communities page. These are all of our AARP age-friendly communities as of December of last year. And so you can look up your state or region and see if you have any communities that are participating in our network of age-friendly communities. We are constantly adding to this list and recruiting more communities to participate in this program. So, and you can click here to get more information about that program. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and turn it mic and presentation over to Mildred.
Thank you very much, Jana. And so what Ramona asked me to speak about today was the issue of multi-generational planning for both elders and children. And I wanted to acknowledge my funder for this work is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because they're particularly concerned about how rural communities are going to meet the challenge of both an aging population and meeting the needs of young people. because an aging population creates care needs at both ends of the life cycle, and many of us are the sandwich generation in the middle, with elder parents to care for and with younger children. And as Ramona showed us in our earlier slides, these two ends of the population pyramid are getting thicker. They're an important group that raises a challenge for those of us in the middle. And those of us in the middle are the planners. We're the ones who can make a change. And so what we thought about with our model for thinking about multi-generational planning was the possibility that we could build a common vision between the needs of elders and the needs of children, that we could begin to think about inclusive design that not only supports those who are aging on the elder end of the spectrum, but also supports those who are young children on the young end of the spectrum, and that there also might be possibilities for more sharing of services across generations. And so that's where this idea of planning across generations comes from. Now, when we were doing this research, we looked at the international initiatives for child-friendly cities that UNICEF is sponsoring, and the International Initiative for Age-Friendly Cities that the World Health Organization is sponsoring. And now, while the World Health Organization says its age-friendly cities is for all ages, the bias is very clearly toward the elderly. But if you look at the list of features that are important for child-friendly and for age-friendly, you'll see that there are many common elements. And so the possibility of being an all-age-friendly city is definitely something that's there before us. These principles are reflected in the APA Aging Policy Guide, which Ramona already mentioned to you, and I definitely commend it to you to take a look at it on the website. A team of us worked on that policy guide last year, actually in 2013, and it was accepted in 2014. And it has areas dealing with housing, a variety of types, particularly looking at issues of accessory flats and eliminating family definitions. The land use section talks about promoting connectivity and mixed use. Transportation shifts the paradigm from commuting to mobility, because again, for the young and the very old, it's not so much commuting to work that's important, but the ability to get around to needed services. It also has a very short section on economic well-being, which is inclusive of all ages, and also looks at the importance of care work, elder care, child care, as being parts of the economy that deserve more attention from economic development planners. With regard to community assets, we talk about the need for communities to develop more services and to develop both formal and informal supports. So much of the caregiving that goes on is actually informal, and planning sometimes fails to acknowledge the role it can play in either facilitating informal networks or discouraging them or even making them criminal. So we can think about how we can support both formal and informal networks. And then, of course, it's very important to have participation across age, class, race, and gender, because the needs and interests are different. You see this in AARP, having the little sliders on your livability measures of what you might prefer. But this is also important in communities to get a good sense of what their population is looking for. Now, at the risk of insulting Christine, who's the vice chair of the New Urbanism Division of APA, I'm going to put out the point that there's a new urbanist bias in planning for aging, and I don't think that's going to work for the majority of elders who are in suburban and rural areas. If you're in an area that lacks development pressure, how are you going to redevelop along new urbanist lines? Your built environment is very difficult to change in the short term. And of course, if you can change it, if you can set policies and zoning and planning goals in place so that you can build toward a more walkable mixed-use environment, that's great. But in many rural and suburban areas, you're not facing development pressures, and you're kind of stuck with the built environment you have. So then that raises the question of how can we support aging in place where seniors currently live? And is it possible that a multi-generational approach can help? Because now you've broadened the coalition of who's interested in this, not just the elderly, not just children, Also includes parents with children, and maybe this can build the political will for investment. That's the idea. So we took the World Health Organization used an average functionality curve, this orange curve you see at the bottom, and they didn't really start it with young life. They just started it from adulthood, and as you age, you lose functionality. Particularly in the U.S. context, when you give up the keys to your car, you really lose your independence. So improved functionality can be achieved through more inclusive design. This is the physical design of your environment. Where you can't make it up on inclusive design, you're going to have to make it up on service provision. And this is where the role of community services, both formal and informal, becomes very important in helping all of us reach full capacity in an enabling environment. What we've done with these curves is back it up to age 0. So you can think about the needs of children. You get born, you learn to crawl, walk, ride a tricycle, ride a bicycle, finally get your driver's license, and your independence, your functionality increases. Again, if we have inclusive design in our neighborhoods and adequate service provision, this not only enhances the independence of children as well as elders, it also enhances the independence of the rest of us, the sandwich in the middle, because we spend less time as soccer moms or carrying people around when they can do it for themselves. So everybody wins in a multi-generational planning environment. So where are we now? Well, I'm going to present today the results of a survey that we conducted in 2013 with the International City-County Management Association. This was funded in part by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we made a special effort to reach rural and suburban communities, not just urban ones. We had almost 1,500 city managers respond, and we surveyed their attitudes, their actions, their zoning, and their planning. And in all the tables that follow, I'm giving you the percent responding. So the first piece is bad news, but no surprise. The built environment is not optimal. Here I'm distinguishing metro core from suburban and rural, and you'll see that the majority of communities no longer have neighborhood schools. They do not have sidewalk systems connecting residents to services. Most don't have playgrounds within a half mile of residence, which is the idea of the maximum distance someone might walk. Access to fresh food markets is a problem. Retail and housing mix a problem. Bike lanes and complete streets, the least common. So, and the problems tend to be worse in suburban and rural communities. Again, this is in part the reason why I think we talk about new urbanism, but we have to realize that the urban bias in that may not help us get to where we need to go. So what about regulations? How are we coming on regulations to promote connectivity, mixed use, density? Well, again, we see that rural and suburban areas lag behind, and they lag way behind, for example, in mandating sidewalk systems. But sidewalks don't make sense in rural areas. They're very expensive. You've got a lot of distance between houses. A sidewalk is probably not the way to go. Street connectivity between adjacent developments, parks, pedestrian-friendly age guidelines. Where we see things come a little closer together are around child care centers and allowing child care businesses and resident units by right, and accessory dwelling units. These are lower, fewer communities have them, but we see less of a difference between urban, suburban, and rural. Service delivery also lags in suburbs and rural areas. We had 2 questions on the survey. The red one is, do families with children find the range of services they need in your community? And the blue one is, do seniors find the range of services? And again, we see that in metro core communities, you're more likely to find the range of services that you need. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, one possibility is to look at this notion of shared services, joint programming for different ages within one facility. And a facility that's particularly important is the public school. So we asked a series of questions about whether schools and the local government share facilities. And again, we see the same metro core, suburban, rural gradient of more sharing in the metro core areas, where it actually might be a little less necessary, and less sharing as you move down into suburban and rural areas. We find that planners are very unlikely to participate in school district educational facility planning. Look at those scores, 41% in the metro core, 20% in rural. This is an area where I think it would be good to see some radical change. Then we asked if there are any services provided in the community's public schools, services that are not just for school children, but are for other members of the community. And we find that services for children, like child care services, are more likely to be found, or adult education and recreation programs. Less likely is nutrition and health. But here, notice that in nutrition and meals for seniors, you're seeing rural areas using their schools as a place. Here you have an industrial kitchen, you have a large cafeteria. The possibility of doing a third lunch period and having that be your congregate meal site is an option that some rural communities are taking advantage of. Now, what are the barriers to joint programming for different ages? We asked about a series of barriers, and funding is the barrier that sits at the top. And this will have to do with higher level government programs, whether they be federal or state funding that is based on an age segregated model, as so many of our programs for seniors have been. And this is what local planners see as the problem. The primary problem to joint programming for different ages is the issue of funding. Some of the literature had suggested that liability, regulations, and preference for age-segregated services among the users would be the big barriers. But those, as you can see, all rank much, much lower than the funding problems. So I think if we could begin to work with our state and federal agencies to tell them to get out of their age-segregated paradigms and begin to think about programs that support all ages, I think you could see that planners are ready to move. One of the issues with new paradigms for looking at aging in community is the need for cross-agency partnerships. And so we asked what kinds of cross-agency partnerships do we see to promote multi-generational planning. And libraries and parks and recreation departments, they top the list. They've got it, they figured out that this is important, and they're very, very engaged. Who's at the bottom of the list? The agencies that are most close to planners: your economic development agency, your planning department, your transportation and highway department, and your housing agency outside of the cities. Now, these are agencies, my friends, that we all work for, and we can begin to think about how we might reach out for cross-agency partnerships to begin to meet the needs of children and elders. We have a lot of work to do, and we clearly need to step up to the plate because, according to these city managers who answers the survey, we are the least likely to be participating in cross-agency partnerships. The final part of the survey asked about attitudes. Do city managers see the link between serving families and children with seniors? And so we ask a series of questions. Seniors are a resource for the community. Children are a resource for a community. The community has a responsibility to care for children or a responsibility to care for seniors. And you can see that the agreement looking at children and seniors is pretty similar across the board. We get to the bottom two questions where we say, do seniors generate sufficient tax revenue to cover the cost of services they demand, or do families with children? And the answer is no. It costs more to serve children and to serve seniors. And so it's not the case that these are groups that pay for the cost of services that they demand. But the reality is we all get born, we all grow up, and if we're lucky, we get to live into a ripe old age. And so a multi-generational planning approach acknowledges the fact that these are population groups that don't cover their costs, but they're population groups that you want to have in your community because it helps you make your community more vibrant. And that's what you see in the middle two. Communities that keep people for their entire lifespan are more vibrant. So when you think about planning, we also ask a series of questions about whether you give specific attention in your plans to families with children or to seniors. And what we noticed is that in emergency plans, yes, you're starting to see language that gives some attention to the needs of children or seniors. Again, about 2/3 of the time. In comprehensive plans, that specific language looking at the needs of seniors and children drops to 50%. And in economic development plans, it drops to 25 to 30%. So we have a lot of work here to do to begin to incorporate children and senior issues, particularly into economic development and comprehensive planning. So I'd like to suggest to you that as we move toward the future, we really do need to think about a planning across generations approach. There's a number of issue briefs in addition to the one that we did for APA. There's a number more on my website, which is just mildredwarner.org/planning. And with this, I'm done, and I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Okay, I'm just trying to get the slideshow to begin. There we go. Okay, can everyone hear me and see my slides?
Yes, you look great and you sound great.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so thank you, Mildred. My name is Lindsay Goldman. I am the project director for Age-Friendly New York City at the New York Academy of Medicine. The New York Academy of Medicine is an independent organization that advances solutions to promote the health and well-being of people in cities worldwide. And our current priorities are healthy aging, prevention, and eliminating health disparities. Just to sort of set the stage here, you see some demographics of older people in New York City. We have 1.4 million people who are 60 plus, and that's about 17% of the total population. A quarter of them are working. About a quarter have difficulty with mobility and self-care. 58% live in Brooklyn or Queens. If you're familiar with New York City, those are two of the outer boroughs where services are often not as concentrated as they may be in Manhattan. 55% rent, 30% live alone, and 15.5% are poor, which is higher than the national average. So in 2007, the New York Academy of Medicine partnered with the New York City Council and the Office of the Mayor to implement the World Health Organization's framework for an age-friendly city, which basically says that if you work across these 8 domains that you see on your screen, you can actually slow or reverse the disability trajectory that you saw before in Mildred's presentation. And so we've been working within those domains. We started by speaking directly to older people, which we've been doing from the beginning and we continue to do today in their neighborhoods, in the languages that they speak, paying close attention to the diversity of the city to include our large immigrant population. And then we developed an action plan to address the issues that were identified during all of these community consultations. We also convened a multi-sector commission for an age-friendly New York City to guide and oversee the action plan implementation and to ensure that age-friendly concepts, practices, and principles penetrated the private sector. And we've had some really significant outcomes from 2007 through today. We've seen improvements to the built environment as well as enhancements to programs and services that have improved the health and safety of older New Yorkers. But there's still a lot of work to be done to address our projected population growth, which you can see in this chart. So here we have a map of the community dwelling older population in New York City. It's overlaid with the evacuation zones, and there are quite a few older people, so I know this is difficult to see. But the important thing to note is that the evacuation zones have more older people, higher levels of poverty, disability, and people who don't speak English. New York is extremely diverse. 55% of our older population was born outside the United States, and 29% speak English less than very well. Sometimes, this works for them. They live in large ethnic enclaves, like Chinatown, whereas in other cases, you have small pockets of linguistically isolated people. So these little blue dots up here represent a Chinese-speaking population in East Harlem, where most of the services are provided in English or Spanish. We have 18,000 units of housing that are exclusively for older people in the city, but the majority of older people don't live in age-segregated housing. 80% of older people have some kind of rent subsidy, as housing is extremely expensive in New York City. But what you can see is that a lot of these buildings were created in the flood zone, and the majority have elevators. So within this context, we've had multiple disasters over the last 14 years in New York City, and in each case we saw the same thing we saw during Hurricane Sandy, which was tens of thousands of people trapped in high-rises and private homes without access to heat, power, food, water, medical attention, medications, or their social supports. We know that disasters are going to increase in frequency and severity in our region, and we know that the population of older people is growing. And so the question isn't, if the next disaster will strike, but rather when, and what are we going to do about it? Immediately after Hurricane Sandy, the Institute of Medicine and the New York Academy of Medicine convened a meeting of healthcare leadership to discuss the immediate research priorities that we needed to look at following the storm. So we were funded by the New York Community Trust and the Altman Foundation, and we chose to focus on the needs of community-dwelling older people in disasters because that population has some overlapping concerns with other populations that may be vulnerable in a disaster, but also that population has some of their own issues which are more of a function of age and life stage. We convened an Older Adults in Disasters Policy Advisory Committee with representation from sectors such as housing and healthcare and nonprofits, philanthropy, as well as community-based organizations that were located in the most seriously affected areas. We conducted a literature review. We looked at a whole lot of secondary data. Most of it was canvassing data collected immediately after the storm to identify people in need. We also looked at disaster case management data and data relating to the FEMA crisis counseling program that was implemented in New York City. We conducted 55 key informant interviews and focus groups with 138 people, and we did the mapping that you saw a few slides ago. So what does the literature say about older people and disasters? Well, not surprisingly, it says that older people may be more vulnerable to disaster because they have a predisposition to mobility and cognitive impairment. They're likely to have multiple chronic conditions, sometimes diminished sensory awareness, so they may not be able to smell food if it's spoiled, or they may not be able to navigate a dark environment or an unfamiliar environment like a shelter. They're more likely to be socially isolated and live alone, and they're more likely to have financial limitations because they often live on fixed incomes. But what we found that was somewhat surprising was that there's actually evidence to support that older people may actually be more psychologically resilient in a disaster, and that their increased life experience may have a protective value. And this is encapsulated in the quote that you see down here, which is from a woman who said, you know, I wasn't afraid of what could happen worse than what I'd already been through. So, you know, been there, done that, and we'll just get through this too. So we wanted to know what older New Yorkers had to say, and so we conducted focus groups in 5 communities where they had been significantly affected by the storm, and we worked with community-based organizations to help us with recruitment. So we had two types of focus groups in each of these communities. The first was with older people, which was defined as people who were 60 and over, who lived in the areas and were affected by the storm in some way. And the second group was for frontline responders, which were people of any age who assisted older people before, during, and after the storm, but were not part of the formal emergency management sector. So, for example, social workers, volunteers, pharmacists, porters, maintenance men, home health aides, and we conducted these groups in English, Mandarin, and Spanish. So I'm going to go through our findings pretty quickly. The first finding speaks to the importance of social networks. Under ordinary conditions, most older people manage their health issues and live independently with little to no assistance, which means they're likely not connected to services, and they don't appear on lists of people with special needs. When there's power, they can, get up to their apartment on the 22nd floor, and so, they're doing just fine. It's only when the systems and services they rely on become compromised that they then have a problem. So these people are likely not to see themselves as vulnerable necessarily. We found that those people who had stronger and more numerous connections often reported having had their needs met by individuals and institutions, whereas those with weaker and fewer connections were more likely to report having felt abandoned. To make decisions, older people often consulted with their family, friends, and neighbors, and we saw very high levels of social cohesion within multifamily housing, which really benefited residents who worked together to meet their needs. We also saw instances of collective processing of information and decision-making, and even some bullying. There were some older people, though, who became separated from their social networks because of disruptions in transportation and communication, and they were less likely to have multiple modalities of communication at their disposal, and they mostly relied on landlines, whereas other populations were able to communicate through cell phones and Facebook and Twitter and all of the other social media platforms that proved essential in getting people's needs met during and after the storm. And so as a result, you had this large segment of the population that was unable to maintain situational awareness and obtain resources. And this was especially true within those linguistically isolated populations I mentioned before. Our second finding speaks to the lack of comprehensive planning to maintain the health status of older people, which led to the exacerbations of chronic conditions and the emergence of new conditions caused by interruptions in healthcare, including medication management and home care and loss of durable medical equipment. Here you have a picture of one of the shelters where older people repeatedly reported that they were inaccessible, uncomfortable, and unsafe, and that they actually served as a barrier to evacuation because, as one woman said, I could be killed there, and I'd rather just stay here and be killed here. And some of this was sort of grounded in reality, having experienced the shelter system during Hurricane Irene, and some of this was based on, perception of what the shelter must be like. Here you have the food truck delivering some emergency food. You see this is a very long line, and there were no accommodations for older people to sit down, no way to give them some priority in terms of moving up the line. We heard reports that the trucks didn't wait long enough for older people who may be moving slower. We also heard a lot about information and food as well being delivered to the lobby of buildings. And when that happened, older people who were unable to navigate the many stairs in their buildings, those people did not receive the information or services that they needed. But on the bright side, we found that older people actively supported their communities before, during, and after the storm. So I mentioned that we had two different types of focus groups. The first was for older people, and the second was for frontline responders. And there was no age criteria for the responders group. And we found that these two groups were not actually so different. the average age of residents was 72, and the average age of responders was 51. And we actually had one responder in our focus group who was 83 and on oxygen and had coordinated a massive canvassing operation on the Lower East Side. Older adults were especially useful in understanding and meeting the needs of other, more isolated older people. Local organizations were often more effective in understanding and responding to communities' needs, including the needs of older people, than outside organizations, even when those local organizations had sustained their own losses. A lot of responders said that they intentionally sheltered in place rather than evacuate, because they believed they would be needed to provide assistance to others. But these organizations reported that their biggest challenges were lack of coordination and lack of integration into the city's emergency management plans. So as a result, the resources were not equitably distributed. Some people had 3 knocks on their door, and some people had no knocks on their door. And this is best illustrated by the man who was found having drowned in his home in Far Rockaway in April, and the storm was in October. The other issue that these organizations saw was that they were often called upon to address older people's needs that were more medical, whereas they were human service agencies that didn't have that capacity. This is the Midland Avenue Neighborhood Relief Center. It's where we conducted our focus group on Staten Island, and this was the site of someone's house that fell down. His family brought him a crate of supplies, and he said, thank you, I don't need all of this, and I'm going to share it with my neighbors. And slowly more people started bringing supplies, and it became this sort of organically emerging hub, not only for the distribution of supplies, but also for a real source of social support for the people who had been affected by the storm. And so our overall takeaways. In New York City, following each of those disasters that I mentioned, we've seen the same conditions, and that's because we've invested time and energy into the same kinds of initiatives, which promote individual preparedness through go bags and checklists. So we haven't actually seen any improved outcomes as a result of these investments. And we know that there are real barriers to older people complying with disaster preparedness requirements, which are mostly about collecting stuff. They may not have the money to buy the stuff, the ability to carry the stuff, space to store the stuff, and if they buy the stuff that's recommended for the first 3 days, what happens on the 4th day or the 28th day or 4 months later when the power is still out in some areas? And so while we recognize that individual preparedness is a critical step, our research has indicated that regardless of the possible disaster scenarios, it's essential that communities develop the capacity to respond and adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And to do this, we need to recognize that emergency preparedness, response, and recovery must be addressed by all sectors and all government agencies, rather than exclusively relegated to the Department of Emergency Management, the Department for the Aging, or the Department of Health. We need to integrate preparedness and resilience into routine activities of daily life. So for older people, where a disaster often leads to a health or financial crisis, preparedness needs to be embedded in efforts to promote wellness, health literacy, and economic security. So for example, we know that the financial losses of disaster are particularly devastating. Older people often receive less aid and have more difficulty recovering financially. And when we connect older people to all of the benefits and entitlements they're eligible for, like rent increase exemption programs and nutrition programs and free tax preparation, we enhance their economic security, we improve their quality of life, and we also prepare them for disasters, though we don't traditionally think of those activities as disaster preparedness. So we have 12 recommendations, and you can see a summary of our report as well as the full report on our website. But the 12 recommendations really fall into 4 buckets. The first is that we need to engage older people as part of the solution. According to one set of data we analyzed, older people were more interested in ongoing community participation than younger people. So we want to channel this energy to strengthen communities under routine conditions and also to help them recover from disasters. So we think that training older people to assist their neighbors is a good thing. The second group of recommendations is around developing emergency plans with an aging lens. A lot of the issues that we saw that older people had during the storm could have been averted had they been consulted on the various emergency plans that the city was going to implement. So, for example, home health aides were not considered, nor were hospice providers as part of these emergency plans. And so when there were efforts to preserve the public safety by blocking off certain parts of the community that had been affected, those efforts had the unintended consequence of negatively impacting the health of older people who did not have access to their home attendants or hospice providers. To build response capacity on behalf of older people, we recommend training professional and volunteer first responders on the needs of older people in emergencies, as well as we recommend that cities establish memoranda of understanding with aging service providers in advance, which is done in several counties in California right now. And once the community begins planning, it's critical that they share their plans. And so to facilitate the kind of participatory planning that's required for effective collective response, we recommend creating community resilience hubs. And so this is about, how we use public space to enable the community to plan together. And these would be one-stop shops for community preparedness, communication, and response. And existing venues can be used for this purpose. And finally, we recommend strengthening the social networks that can help to identify people in need and provide assistance to them in a disaster. And so we focus a lot on housing as a critical point of intervention. Landlords need to know who's in their buildings and how those people might become vulnerable in an emergency. And we also recommend increasing older people's access to multiple forms of communication. So I'll end there to allow for enough time for questions and answers. And here you have the contact information for all of the speakers on this call. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, again, folks, you can you can type in your questions in the chat box to the right of your screen, and just be sure to include who the question is for, if it's for a particular panelist. So we do have some questions that have already come in, so let's get those started. We definitely have questions coming in regarding the Livability Index. The first question is, does the Livability Index directly relate to senior living only, or can the Livability Index be applied to the general population?
So great question, and I should have mentioned it up front. Our Livability Index is relevant to people of all ages. So while AARP had a lens of looking at what do people 50 plus need in their communities, the metrics and policies that we include within the index are really as relevant to my son and my grandmother as they are to other older adults in the community. So for instance, we look at not only the frequency of fixed route public transportation service in the community, which is applicable to anyone, but then we also add on to that a metric that looks at the accessibility of the fleet and stations of the fixed route public transportation system, which is something that really is beneficial to people of all ages, mothers pushing strollers, etc.
Okay, thank you. Next one is again for Jana. It says, I noticed that the category score for the Mission Street housing was 88. Given housing prices in San Francisco, are the scores adjusted by market, or is that a nationwide score?
So I don't know, Christy, if you're able to give me back the screen, I could pull that address up again.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll do that right now.
If we want to take. So I'm going to go back to that address. And the question, I believe, was housing. And housing is an interesting category. And one of the things that people ask a lot of questions about is the housing costs. And even here, we know that San Francisco is a very expensive city to buy into or to find a place to rent. But the way that we measure housing costs is based on the amount that people are paying, existing residents pay. And it includes residents who are benefiting from San Francisco's very strong rent control policies. So it would include within a neighborhood residents who may have been there for 20 years and whose rents have not risen to meet the market rate. So it's not reflecting market rate housing prices of the day. So it also, overall, what's contributing to that housing score of 88 is places, typically downtown places, very urban places, have a lot of multifamily housing. That's one of our indicators. And as well, we have availability of subsidized housing units. And those, again, tend to be concentrated in more downtown areas. So places like San Francisco would do fairly well. And we also include housing cost burden, which is in part based upon the existing housing costs. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, great. Thank you. We might as well just leave this screen up. I think there's 2 more questions specifically related to the index. So if you don't mind, we'll just leave your screen up just in case you need it again. The next question is, what are the communities measured against? Their state, each other, a general standard?
So scores are built up from the neighborhood level. So there are over 200,000 census block groups in the United States. And so these green dots, as you open up the results page, reflect if you're green, it means you're performing in the top 1/3 of all neighborhoods in the United States. Gold would be the middle third, and red would be the bottom third. And so every neighborhood is compared with every other neighborhood in the United States. And then as we build up to the next level of geography, we're comparing it. The next level of geography is an average of all the neighborhoods within it, and it then gets compared to other places of that level of geography across the United States.
Okay, the next question is, so disability status increases with age. How does the index reflect the needs of that population? For example, housing with accessibility features identified in the census.
Right, so there's a couple of different ways that we try to capture that within the index. It's one of those areas where the data is somewhat limiting, but within housing, for instance, our first top metric is housing accessibility. This is basic passage, so it includes the number of units with extra wide doors and hallways, floors with no steps between rooms, and an entry-level bedroom and bathroom. And it one thing we don't include, which is very important, but currently the Census Bureau does not track it, and that is whether you can actually get into your home with a 0-step entrance. And unfortunately, we do not have data on that. There is data at the census level as to whether there are ramps into people's homes, but AARP as a policy, we want to push the concept of visitability and universal design with pushing the 0-step entrance, so we did not include the ramps as part of our measurement. Then on the transportation side, I mentioned this earlier, we also look at ADA accessible stations and vehicles, the percent of the transit fleet and stations that are accessible. Also under policies, we include, well, complete streets. Planners are familiar with this. That is, of course, important for people of all abilities. We also include whether there's state policies supportive of coordination of human services transportation, which primarily serves more vulnerable individuals with mobility limitations, whether there's state policies supportive of volunteer drivers. And again, on health, there's, I think these are largely universal, not specific to a specific population group such as persons with disabilities. I don't believe any of our others are that specific either, but we have tried to get at it in different ways.
Okay, next question. I'd like to have someone from AARP present the Livability Index at an upcoming statewide planning conference. Who should we contact? So are there local chapter contacts that might be available to go to groups and do the same thing that you just did for us today?
Possibly. The best person to contact, or you'd want to reach out to our state office, either probably the community outreach director. Okay. I will say that if I can pull this slide back up from my presentation, we are planning forums on the Livability Index with our state offices in several, how do I minimize this thing? All right, take it down, in several locations between now and the remainder of the year. On June 25th, my colleague Rodney Harrell will be in West Sacramento, California, and then this fall, we're planning on being in these locations. Given that within the Public Policy Institute, there's really only 3 of us working on the Livability Index, our ability to travel will be somewhat limited, at least in 2015, but we certainly would entertain the possibility through our state office of attending one of your conferences and presenting.
Okay, thank you. It looks like there's one more question. Again, this is for you, Jana. Sorry.
That's okay.
How are the indicators with different units averaged to calculate the overall score?
That's an excellent question. So you will notice as you open up, I'm trying to think which is the best level to open up. If I open up the neighborhood indicators, you can see once you open it up, each of our indicators does say what scale it's measured at. Neighborhood scale is at the census block level. Again, everything's built up from the census block level, but where we don't have neighborhood level data, for instance, crime rates, which is quite unfortunate, we would apply the same crime rate to every neighborhood or census block group in that county, since it's a county level measure. So it's imprecise, and we do the best that we can do, I should say, with the data that we have. And then once it's applied downward, then everything gets averaged together at that neighborhood level and built up from there.
Okay. Oh, wait, one more question came in. Okay, one more. Why are you using census block groups for the Livability Index? The ACS data for sample data is 1 out of 40 households are surveyed, and several data experts have identified that the lower the geographic level, the higher the margin of error is. And many data experts recommend not going any lower than the census tract level, or to combine block groups and present the data in that manner. Why not use census tracts instead of census block groups?
So we wanted to get down to as fine a level of geography as we could. In some cases where the sample size of block group data is very low, we combine several years of data. So an example of that is under transportation, our I think crash rates. Again, this isn't from the census, but it's applying it down to that neighborhood level from the fatality analysis reporting system. And it's, again, an average of 5 years of data. So there are examples where we do combine multiple years in order to get the sample size up to where we feel fairly confident that we can project at the census block group level.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think that pretty much does it. Lindsay, I'm going to put you back in charge, if you wouldn't mind accepting, just so that we can have everyone's contact information up real quick one more time. Thank you very much. Okay, so that seems to be the end of our questions for today. Everyone got off pretty easy there, except for poor Jana. But this livability index obviously has a lot of interesting points to it, and we're glad to have it out. We're excited about it. So with that, Ramona from the Private Practice Division, thank you, and Jana and Lindsay and Mildred for speaking today. We appreciate you coming in and joining us, and for rescheduling after our last attempt. So everyone, have a great week, and we will see you next time.